Moving into Lila's house felt like stepping into someone else's life. Her place was spotless, smelled like lavender, and had this carefully curated charm, like something out of a home decor catalog. It was miles away from the cluttered chaos I'd grown used to. Lila wasn't the kind of step-grandmother you'd picture. At 42, she looked more like a fitness instructor than someone who should be hosting holiday dinners. She'd married Grandpa Joe in her late 20s, a whirlwind romance that the family had gossiped about for years. And now, 2 years after his passing, she was a widow with a paid-off house and enough charm to disarm anyone who doubted her intentions. When my dad suggested I crash with her while I sorted out my life post-college, I wasn't thrilled. But after burning through my savings and exhausting all options, I caved. Living with Lila wasn't just my last resort. It was my only one. At first, our conversations were shallow. She asked polite questions about my job search while I muttered half-hearted responses, feeling like a failure every time. But the walls between us started to crumble faster than I expected. One night, after she came home from her yoga class, she set a bottle of wine on the counter and asked, "Want a glass? You look like you could use one." I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Sure, why not?" We ended up sitting on the couch, the wine making both of us a little looser. She told me stories about her childhood in Florida and her short-lived dreams of becoming a dancer. I told her about my frustration with job rejections and the creeping fear that I was wasting my life. "You're too hard on yourself," she said, her voice soft. "You're only 23. You got time to figure things out." "Feels like I don't," I muttered, avoiding her eyes. She reached out, resting her hand on my arm. "You remind me of me at your age, always so worried about the future. Sometimes you just have to let things happen." The way she looked at me then made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just the words. It was the way her gaze lingered, the way her fingers brushed mine for a second longer than necessary. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday night. We'd ordered pizza and opened a bottle of wine, falling into an easy rhythm of teasing and joking. At some point, she suggested playing cards. "You don't even know how to play poker," I said, smirking. She raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in her eye. "Try me?" We sat across from each other, the game starting off innocent enough. But as the night went on, the teasing shifted. She leaned closer when she spoke, her laugh soft and low. By the time the game ended, the tension between us was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You're blushing," she said, tilting her head. "I'm not," I shot back, even though I could feel the heat creeping up my neck. Her gaze lingered, her smile fading into something more serious. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, almost without thinking, I leaned in. The kiss was quick, almost hesitant, but it was enough to send my heart racing. When we pulled back, her expression was unreadable. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice shaky. "We can't." But the way she said it wasn't convincing. I spent the rest of the night lying awake in my room, staring at the ceiling. What had I just done? What had we started? One thing was certain: life under this roof was never going to be the same. The morning after that kiss, the house felt different. Or maybe it was just me. I couldn't look at Lila without replaying the moment, the feel of her lips, the way her breath hitched like she hadn't expected it. But now, in the harsh light of day, it all felt wrong. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee, pretending to scroll through job listings on my laptop. Lila breezed in, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, wearing yoga pants and a tank top. She looked casual, composed, like nothing had happened. "Morning," she said, her voice bright. Too bright. "Morning," I muttered, not looking up. She moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, pouring herself a glass of water before sitting across from me. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and I could feel her eyes on me. "About last night," she started, her tone careful. I looked up, my heart hammering in my chest. "It was a mistake," she said quickly. "We were drinking, and I don't know what got into me. It won't happen again." I nodded, but her words didn't sit right. She sounded more like she was convincing herself than me. "Yeah," I said finally. "A mistake." Over the next few days, we tried to pretend nothing had happened, but it was impossible to go back to how things were. Every time we were in the same room, the air between us was charged, like we were both waiting for the other to say something, do something. One night, I decided to escape the tension by going for a run. When I came back, drenched in sweat, Lila was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes lingering on me longer than they should have. "Good run?" she asked, her voice soft. "Yeah," I said, grabbing a towel from the laundry basket and wiping my face. "You're working hard," she said almost to herself. "You look good." The compliment caught me off guard. I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. Thanks," I said awkwardly, draping the towel around my neck. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made my stomach twist. A week after the kiss, the boundary was crossed again. It was late, the house quiet except for the hum of the fridge. I couldn't sleep, so I'd gone to the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I stood by the sink, staring out into the dark backyard, I heard soft footsteps behind me. "Can't sleep?" Lila's voice was low, almost a whisper. I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her silk robe loosely tied around her waist. She looked like she belonged in a movie, messy hair, bare feet, the soft glow of the kitchen light casting shadows across her face. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "Something like that." She stepped closer, her eyes searching mine. "Me neither." For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Then, before I could stop myself, I said, "Why can't we?" Her breath hitched, and she took another step closer. "Ryan." This time, she didn't pull away. The kiss was different this time. It wasn't hesitant or unsure. It was hungry, desperate, like we'd both been holding back for too long. Her hands tangled in my hair, and mine found the small of her back, pulling her closer. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, her forehead resting against mine. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "I know," I said, my voice steady. "But I don't care." We didn't talk about it the next day, or the day after that. But the shift was undeniable. She'd brush past me in the hallway, her touch lingering just a second too long. At night, I'd lie awake in my room, the memory of her lips on mine burning in my mind. I knew it couldn't last. Secrets like this don't stay buried for long. But in those stolen moments, I didn't care about the consequences. By the third week, it was impossible to ignore the patterns we were slipping into. Our secret moments were becoming more frequent. Little touches, lingering glances, whispers exchanged late at night. It was dangerous, and we both knew it. But the more we tried to resist, the more we found ourselves pulled back together. The tipping point came on a lazy Sunday afternoon. Lila had suggested we watch a movie, some old rom-com she claimed was her favorite. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, but as the film played, the space between us seemed to shrink. At one point, her hand brushed against mine, and instead of pulling away, she left it there. Neither of us said anything, but the silence spoke volumes. That evening, I decided to talk to her. Keeping this quiet was eating me alive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to give. I found her in the kitchen, washing dishes. "Lila," I said, leaning against the counter. She glanced at me over her shoulder, her expression guarded. "What's up?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. She turned off the faucet and dried her hands, then faced me. "Okay, talk." I hesitated, unsure where to start. "What are we doing?" I finally asked. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought she might deflect. But then she sighed, leaning against the counter across from me. "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen." But what?" I pressed. She hesitated, biting her lip. "But I can't stop thinking about you," she said softly. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I should have felt guilty. I should have walked away. But instead, I stepped closer. "Lila," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is not just you. I can't stop thinking about you either." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of our confession hanging in the air. Then, without warning, she reached out, pulling me into a kiss that left no room for doubt. The next few days were a blur. We became reckless, stealing kisses in the hallway, brushing against each other when no one was watching. I started to lose track of time, the boundaries between right and wrong blurring more with each passing moment. But it wasn't just us in the house. My dad, Bill, came over that Friday. He had called earlier in the week saying he wanted to check in and see how I was doing. I could feel my chest tighten when he walked through the door, his presence a stark reminder of how much we had to lose. "Place looks great, Lila," he said, glancing around. "You've really kept it up since Dad." His voice trailed off, but Lila smiled warmly, masking the tension beneath the surface. "Thanks, Bill," she said. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Just a beer if you've got it," he said, dropping onto the couch. I hovered near the kitchen doorway, watching the interaction with a mix of anxiety and guilt. Lila moved around the kitchen effortlessly, handing him a beer before sitting down across from him. "So, Ryan," my dad said, turning to me, "how's the job hunt going?" "It's slow," I admitted, scratching the back of my neck. "Well, don't give up," he said. "Something will come along. In the meantime, I'm glad you've got Lila looking out for you." The words stung more than they should have. I nodded, forcing a tight smile. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that my dad was watching us more closely than usual. Every time Lila and I exchanged a glance, his eyes flicked between us, his expression unreadable. At one point, when Lila got up to clear the plates, he leaned closer to me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Why wouldn't it be?" He shrugged, but his gaze didn't waver. "Just seems like, I don't know, something feels different." Before I could respond, Lila returned, and the conversation shifted. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it grew. That night, after my dad left, I found Lila in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at the blank TV screen. "He knows," I said, sitting down beside her. She didn't look at me. "He doesn't know anything." "Not yet, but he suspects," I said, my voice tight. "And if he finds out?" "He won't," she said firmly, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were filled with a determination that sent a shiver down my spine. "We'll be careful." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was wrong. Secrets like ours don't stay hidden forever. By the time Friday rolled around again, the tension in the house was unbearable. Every glance, every word between Lila and me felt like a tightrope walk. My dad's visit the week before had rattled both of us. His suspicions lingered like a dark cloud, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were one slip away from disaster. It all came to a head one evening when I overheard Lila on the phone. I had been in my room, scrolling through job listings I had no real interest in, when her voice drifted down the hallway. At first, it was soft, almost too quiet to hear, but then she laughed, soft and flirtatious. The kind of laugh I thought was reserved for me. I crept toward the living room, my heart pounding. She was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her, the phone pressed to her ear. "I know," she said, her voice low and sweet. "It's just been complicated lately." "Complicated?" My chest tightened as I strained to hear more. "No, I can't tonight," she continued. "But soon. I promise." She laughed again, and something inside me snapped. "Who was that?" I asked, stepping into the room. Lila flinched, her eyes widening as she saw me. She quickly ended the call, setting the phone down on the coffee table. "Ryan," she said, her tone calm but defensive. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me," I said, crossing my arms. "What was it?" She hesitated, her gaze darting to the phone before meeting mine. "It was just a friend. Nothing more." I let out a bitter laugh. "A friend? You don't talk to friends like that." Her jaw tightened, and she stood, putting some distance between us. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I?" I shot back. "Because it sure sounds like you've been keeping secrets. And after everything." "Don't." She cut me off, her voice sharp. "Don't turn this into something it's not." "Something it's not?" I repeated, my voice rising. "What are we, Lila?" "Huh?" "Because it feels like I'm risking everything for someone who's playing games." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You think this is a game to me?" "I don't know what to think," I shouted. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us crackling with tension. Then, her expression softened, and she took a step closer. "Ryan," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. It's complicated, and it's dangerous. But it's not a game." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe her, but the doubt gnawed at me. Then stop lying to me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. It was enough to break the dam. The next day, everything came crashing down. My dad called, saying he wanted to stop by again. I tried to come up with an excuse, but he insisted. When he arrived, the tension was palpable. Lila greeted him with her usual warm smile, but I could see the strain in her eyes. "So," my dad said as he sat down at the dining table, "how's life treating you too?" "Great," Lila said quickly. "Ryan's been a big help around the house." I forced a tight smile, my hands clenched under the table. For the first half of the visit, we managed to keep up the charade. But then my dad started asking questions. Little things, seemingly innocent, but each one felt like a test. "How's the job hunt going, Ryan?" "Good," I said, trying to sound confident. "I've got a few leads." "Good to hear," he said, his eyes flicking to Lila. "And how's everything else? You two getting along okay?" The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. "We're fine," Lila said, her voice a little too bright. My dad leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. "You sure about that?" The silence was deafening. That night after my dad left, Lila and I had it out. "We can't keep doing this," she said, pacing the living room. "Doing what?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "Pretending everything's fine? Or pretending this, whatever this is, doesn't mean anything." She stopped, turning to face me. "You don't understand. If your dad finds out, if anyone finds out, then what?" I demanded. "What happens, Lila? Because right now it feels like we're already falling apart." She didn't answer. Instead, she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. Her vulnerability stopped me in my tracks. For a moment, I didn't see the confident, put-together woman I'd been drawn to. I saw someone who was just as lost as I was. Without thinking, I sat beside her, pulling her into my arms. She didn't resist. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. "Together." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I hope you're right," she said, "because I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Neither did I. A week later, I found myself sitting at the dining room table, staring down at a plate of roast chicken I couldn't bring myself to touch. Around me, the house was filled with the sounds of clinking glasses and polite laughter. My dad had decided to host a family dinner, a little get-together. He called it at Lila's place. Lila had gone all out. The table was set with her best dishes. Candles flickered in the center, and the air smelled like rosemary and garlic. She moved around the room effortlessly, pouring wine and laughing at jokes, her smile never faltering. To anyone else, she looked like the perfect hostess. But I knew better. Every glance she stole at me, every brush of her hand against mine as she passed by, was a silent reminder of the chaos simmering beneath the surface. "Ryan," my dad said, pulling me out of my thoughts. "You've been quiet tonight. Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He nodded but didn't look convinced. "You should eat something. Lila worked hard on this meal." I glanced at her, and our eyes met for the briefest of moments before she looked away. "It's nothing fancy," she said, her tone light. "But I'm glad you're all here to enjoy it." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, but I could feel my dad watching me closely. As the evening wore on, the tension in the room grew unbearable. Lila's charm seemed to falter, her laugh a little too forced, her movements a little too stiff. My dad noticed it too. "Everything okay, Lila?" he asked as she poured him another glass of wine. "Of course," she said quickly, her smile tight. "Why wouldn't it be?" He didn't respond, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. I could feel my pulse quicken. Every word, every look felt like it was teetering on the edge of something explosive. It happened just as the dessert was being served. My dad was in the middle of telling a story about his new promotion when Lila accidentally dropped a serving spoon. It clattered loudly against the tile floor, and she cursed under her breath. A rare slip for her. "Everything okay?" my dad asked, his tone sharper this time. "I'm fine," she said, bending down to pick it up. But her hands were shaking, and she avoided looking at him. "That's when it happened. Why don't you just say it?" I blurted out, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The room fell silent. "Say what?" my dad asked, his eyes narrowing. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, my dad's, my aunt's, even Lila's. But it was too late to back down now. "Something's been bothering you since you got here," I said, my voice shaking. "Why don't you just say whatever it is you're thinking?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then my dad leaned back in his chair, his gaze hard and unyielding. "All right," he said. "What's going on between you two?" The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Lila froze, her face pale. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. "Bill," she started, her voice trembling. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" He interrupted, his tone cold. "Because I've been watching the two of you all night. And last week, when I was here, something fell off." My aunt cleared her throat awkwardly, but no one dared to speak. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lila said, trying to sound composed. But her voice cracked, and my dad pounced on it. "You think I'm stupid?" he snapped. "I've seen the way you look at him, and the way he looks at you." "Dad, stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said. "Tell me there's nothing going on between you two." I looked at Lila, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, I considered lying, but the weight of the secret we'd been carrying was too much. "You're not wrong," I said finally, my voice cracking. The room erupted. My dad shot out of his chair, his face red with anger. "Are you kidding me?" he shouted. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Bill, please," Lila said, stepping forward. "Let me explain." "Explain," he roared. "Explain what, Lila?" "That you've been screwing my son." "Dad!" I shouted, stepping between them. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" he demanded, his eyes blazing. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a goddamn betrayal." The words hit like a slap, and for a moment, no one spoke. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Lila said quietly, her voice trembling. "But I care about him." "Care about him?" my dad repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "He's your stepson." The rest of the evening was a blur. My dad stormed out, slamming the door behind him. My aunt followed, muttering something about needing to process what had just happened. When the house was finally quiet, Lila and I sat in the living room, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, she stared out the window, her expression unreadable. For the first time, I realized there might not be a way forward for us. The aftermath of that dinner was like a bomb going off. The family splintered in ways I didn't think were possible. My dad didn't come back to the house after he stormed out, and when he called me the next day, it wasn't to reconcile. "You've ruined everything," he said, his voice cold and steady. "You and Lila both." I tried to explain, but he wasn't interested. He didn't yell, didn't berate me. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, he sounded like he was speaking to a stranger he wanted nothing to do with. "This is your mess," he said before hanging up. "Don't expect me to clean it up." Lila and I barely spoke in the days that followed. She spent most of her time in her room, curtains drawn tight, as if shutting out the world would make it all go away. I tried to talk to her once, but she just shook her head. "Not now, Ryan," she said quietly, not even looking at me. "I can't." The silence in the house was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock felt like a reminder of what we'd done. The breaking point came a week later. Lila sat me down in the living room, her face pale and drawn. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice shaky. "That makes one of us," I muttered, trying to mask my nerves with a weak joke. She didn't laugh. Instead, she clasped her hands together, her knuckles white. Whatever this is between us, it has to end." I stared at her, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Lila, I mean it," she said, cutting me off. "This isn't sustainable. Look at what's happened. Your dad hates you. The family's torn apart. And for what? A few stolen moments?" "It's more than that," I said, my voice rising. "You know it is?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Maybe it feels that way now, but it's not. This was a mistake, Ryan. A mistake that's cost us both too much." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. That night, I packed my bags. I didn't have a plan or a place to go, but staying there felt impossible. Lila didn't try to stop me. She stood in the doorway as I loaded my car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said quietly. "So do I replied, not trusting myself to say more. I drove away without looking back. The weeks that followed were a blur of cheap motels and long stretches of highway. I thought leaving would bring clarity, but it didn't. If anything, it made the hole inside me feel bigger. I thought about calling her more times than I could count. My finger hovered over her number, my chest tight with longing and regret. But I never pressed it. Months later, I heard through my aunt that Lila had sold the house and moved to another state. No one knew where exactly, and no one seemed to care. She'd become a ghost in the family, a name no one mentioned unless it was followed by a curse. As for me, I eventually found a job in Chicago, working at a marketing firm that didn't care about my messy personal life. I kept my head down, avoided family gatherings, and tried to rebuild. But late at night, when the world was quiet, I still thought about her. The last time I saw Lila was by accident. It was a year after everything had fallen apart, in a coffee shop in Denver where I was visiting for a work conference. She was sitting by the window, sipping a latte and reading a book. For a moment, I thought about walking away, pretending I hadn't seen her. But something stopped me. "Lila," I said, my voice uncertain. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. "Ryan." We stared at each other for a moment, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. Then she smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied. We didn't talk long. Just a few pleasantries, a quick update on our lives. She didn't ask if I was happy, and I didn't ask if she missed me. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of closure. Maybe some mistakes aren't meant to be fixed. Maybe some stories aren't meant to have happy endings. But as I stepped back into the cold Denver air, I realized that sometimes walking away is the only way to move forward.